I'm pleased to present our final Hanny Scholar for 2024. And Hannah Mosher is here today, and she's a junior at Willamette from the state of Maine, long way from here. She's majoring in history and minoring in music, and her sponsor is Professor Bill Smaldone, who is here this afternoon. Yes. The presentation title of her work is The Politics of Lily Braun and Clara Zetkin, Key Tenets and Contradictions in the Socialist Feminist Movement. And it explores women's activities in Germany's Social Democratic Party in the pre-World War I period. Her research is the end result of a semester-long project for history of modern socialism. Hannah is also a music minor and heavily involved in the jazz department, participating in small jazz combos. After completing her undergraduate degree, Hannah intends to earn her master's in history, archival studies, or museum studies. Please join me in welcoming Hannah Mosher.
Hello, everyone. Is this a good volume? Okay. Thank you all so much for being here today. I'd like to thank the ICL for having me, and I'd like to thank my advisor, Professor Smaldone, for helping me throughout the formation of this project. So in a complete 180, it's time to talk about socialism. So this presentation will be about the politics of Lily Braun and Clara Zetkin, who are two key figures in the socialist feminist movement. So the research question that I began this project with is which issues divided Clara Zetkin and Lily Braun, and how do these divisions reflect wider conflict in the socialist feminist movement? So to begin my presentation, I'm going to read a little excerpt from the introduction to my paper. Also, I should have mentioned this research is part of a semester-long research project in which I am writing an academic paper on this topic for Professor Smaldone's History of Modern Socialism class. So, although generally overshadowed by later developments of 20th century German politics, the socialist movement, particularly as it took shape in the German Social Democratic Party in the last quarter of the 19th century, dominated the political landscape of European politics during this period of history. Founded in 1875, the German Social Democratic Party became a driving force in socialist politics. Although politics were regarded by many as the man's realm and the party's origins as a male-dominated organization, women soon came to the fore to fight for socialism. Among the prominent female figures in the SPD were the two clashing figures of Clara Zetkin and Lily Braun. Analysis of the radical development of Zetkin and Braun and the issues that would eventually place them on opposite ends of the ideological spectrum allows an exploration into the divisions present in the German social feminist movement at large. So to simplify things, I have these little key topic slides because I'm going to do a lot of talking here, and I will, of course, accept questions at the end. So first, we will get into the Social Democratic Party of Germany, which is abbreviated by SPD, and I will use that abbreviation a lot throughout the presentation, interchanging it with the Social Democratic Party. Secondly, we'll talk about 19th century women's movements. Thirdly, we will introduce Lily Braun, who's our first key figure, and then we will introduce Clara Zetkin. We will talk about issues of division between Braun and Zetkin, and then lastly, I will share some concluding thoughts about my research. So first, we'll talk about the SPD. Socialism came to Germany during the 1800s, which was a massive period of industrialization and change in Germany, and the disadvantaged position of the working classes encouraged them to support a party calling for worker solidarity and better conditions. And the working classes were drawn towards the SPD also as a support system in changing times. The party supported policies like reduction of the working day, suffrage for all adults over 20, including women, which is key to their platform, the right to organize unions, and other policies. So I have a little timeline of the German Social Democratic Party for simplicity's sake. In 1875, the party was founded from the merger of the General German Workers' Union, headed by Ferdinand Lassalle, and the Social Democratic Workers' Party, headed by Wilhelm Liebknecht and August Bebel. And although the party was infused with many, many different viewpoints, from the outset, the party supported workers' emancipation through the transformation of private property into community property. And from 1878 to 1890, which I have on top here, the party is banned by law according to the Chancellor Bismarck's anti-socialist laws. Goodness. And although the party is banned by law, weirdly enough, individual candidates can still run as social democrats and speak out in the Reichstag, which is the German parliament. They just can't sort of directly organize meetings in public and that sort of thing. And because of this policy and the various efforts taking place through underground organization and propaganda, the SPD was still able to grow through this period of the anti-socialist laws. So, for example, in 1885, the party wins 312,000 votes in the Reichstag from the German public, and in 1900, just after emerging out of this period, they win 1,427,000 votes. In 1912, the SPD secured 4,250,000 votes and became the largest party in the German Reichstag. So we see this kind of amazing evolution from quite a small amount of support to quite a large amount of support coming out of a period of having to operate underground. So next I want to talk about the history of feminism in the SPD. So socialism and sex equality have long been associated together. Examples of 19th century socialists like Charles Fourier and Henri Saint-Simon and other prominent figures linked workers and women together in the struggle for emancipation. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels labeled women and workers together as instruments of labor who were continually exploited by the modern industrial system. And Engels specifically argued that socialism was the only system that would offer equality and liberation to women and workers together through its abolition of private property. So this leads nicely into a conversation about August Bebel and men's feminism. Bebel was one of the founding members of the SPD, as I mentioned. In their book, Men's Feminism, Ann Lopez and Gary Roth discuss the interconnectedness of feminism and socialism and argue that for socialist men, advantages and material interests were sort of set aside in favor of an egalitarian ideal. And Bebel and the Social Democrats, Lopez argues, are interesting because they evolved their own feminism as a precursor to the rise of socialist feminism, because at this time in Germany, there was no united proletarian feminist movement. And I'll come back to the topic of men's feminism in Bebel, but first I want to give some background to the rise of socialist feminism by first explaining the position of women in German society during the 19th century. So my two semesters of elementary German are going to try to pronounce this right now, but this society was one of traditional values rooted in what is called the 3 Ks, Kinder, Kirche, and Küche. In English, this translates to children, church, and kitchen. Yes, when applied to the women's role in society, these values essentially relegated her to the family sphere. In her book, Women in German History, From Bourgeois Emancipation to Sexual Liberation, Ute Frevert describes the triple role of women as wives, mothers, and housekeepers, a designation which confined them to the household. And this is specifically in reference to middle class or bourgeois society. In the working class, it was much more common for women to work in industrial sectors and other areas, but similar prejudices were still present, as this was sort of the ideology that permeated German society. So next, I'll talk about feminist movements in the late 1800s. So during the 19th century, women's rights movements were largely concentrated in the middle class. As I mentioned, there is no sort of complete working class feminist movement at this time. Women's emancipation was widely discussed, but largely on a theoretical level without sort of true societal ramifications. And the middle-class women's movement during this time focused largely on the status of married women, both legally and socially, to inherit property, educational access, and other related issues. Therefore, they focused very, very little on issues facing working-class women. And through the later decades of the 19th century, as the SPD began to gain support and Marxist thought was popularized, the socialist feminist movement began to develop. So the primary goal of socialist feminism was to promote the class struggle by creating a so-called new working class woman who would be fully cognizant of her rights and willing to participate in public life and political life. Next, I'll discuss dynamics between men and women inside the SPD. So women's organizations were set up as subsidiary organizations to the main SPD party because until 1908, women were legally barred from joining political parties. And actually, I have a handy slide here talking about the legal restrictions on women's political association. So before 1902, women were barred from political life and had to work around it in various ways. They would disguise themselves to sneak into SPD meetings, which I wish there were pictures of in some socialist archive, but sadly I have not found any. They organized educational women's groups, but these groups were often broken up by police, for instance. In 1902, the Prussian government began allowing women to attend political meetings if they sat in separate sections and remained silent, hence the separate and silent. And in 1908, as I mentioned, women's rights to association were granted. So next I'm going to talk about Clara Zetkin. Zetkin was born in the small German Saxon village of Witterow in 1857 into a family that can be described as sort of having a petty bourgeois status in society. Her father was a schoolmaster in the village, and her mother came from a bourgeois family that was heavily involved, and her mother was heavily involved in liberal circles. So in 1872, Zetkin's family moved to Leipzig in order for the children to continue their education. And while in Leipzig, they lived off of a small penchant given to Zetkin's father. So during this period, she experienced relative poverty, which was influential on her in her later career. Zetkin's mother was a strong believer in French revolutionary ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. And she was also a strong believer in women's economic equality and education, which was certainly a value system that was handed down to her daughter. And she attended the teacher training college at the Van Stuyber Institute in Leipzig, where she received the highest level of education available to women in Germany during this time. And also during this time, she made contact with Russian revolutionaries that were living in Leipzig, which also sort of introduced her to the tenets of socialism. So by 1878, Zetkin was fully committed to socialist ideals, and she enters the SPD during the time when they are operating underground. And at this point in her life, she's developed close ties with many of the leading figures of the party, and also Osip Zetkin, who would later become her partner, introduce her to the work of Marx and Engels. And during this time, most of the party's high-ranking members lived in exile away from Germany, so they were able to conduct their political activities unimpeded, I suppose. So during this time, she moves to Paris to live with her partner, Osip Zetkin, and continue work for the party. So I want to talk a little bit about August Bebel's influence on Zetkin. So his book, Women Under Socialism, was critically important in shaping Zetkin's views on the women question. The main arguments that he puts forward in the book, such as that only through the destruction of capitalist bourgeois society would the working class and women be emancipated, and also that in contemporary society it was necessary for women to get out of the home and into industry and into professions. Both of these ideals were very influential on Zetkin's ideological framework going forward. And one could argue that Zetkin and Babel shared many viewpoints. For example, they both shared a belief that the root of women's oppression rested in private property. They both believed that women and men must unite together to forward the class struggle of the proletariat. But despite these similarities, there were still several points of deviation. Babel believed that women should be more equal, but he did not emphasize the role of motherhood as a central aspect of the woman's role in society, and Zetkin did. She believed strongly in the woman's role as mother to raise the next generation of good proletariats to overthrow the capitalist order. And Ann Lopez argues that the crucial difference between Babel and Zetkin was that Babel wanted to loosen traditional gender roles, whereas Zetkin, in many of her arguments, seems to want to strengthen these traditional roles. And this strengthening of traditional roles is sort of a key component to the evolution of Marxist feminism. And this evolution of maternal ideology can be seen very clearly through the ideology of Zetkin and Lily Braun, who we'll talk about in a second. After the fall of Bismarck and with him the anti-socialist laws, Zetkin settled in Stuttgart in 1890, and she was appointed as the editor of the women's social democratic newspaper Die Gleichheit, which means equality, in 1891. And in order to counter women's oppression, Zetkin believed in the power of the female vote to promote the class struggle and forward the proletariat as a class. In his introduction to the selected works of Zetkin, Philip Foner argues that Zetkin was instrumental in the fight for women's suffrage, concluding that for Zetkin, suffrage was not a solution for all problems, since it left private property intact, but it was an essential weapon in the class struggle. The working class would never triumph without the help of the women, according to Zetkin. So essentially, women's suffrage, in Zetkin's view, was a tool to gain greater proletarian strength. In 1895, she was elected to the governing body of the SPD, being the first woman ever to hold a position of that status. And in 1896, at the Gotha Congress of the Social Democratic Party, Zetkin asserted her increasing influence through her speech, which laid out the impacts of capitalism on women and demonstrated the differences between the struggle of the proletariat versus the struggle of bourgeois women. So I'm going to read an excerpt from this speech because it explains her views on the bourgeois feminist movement very clearly, and it also sort of sets forth her general arguments in terms of what socialist feminism should be. Quote, "The liberation struggle of the proletarian woman cannot be similar to the struggle of the bourgeois woman wages against the male of her class. On the contrary, it must be a joint struggle with the male of her class against the entire class of capitalists. She does not need to fight against the men of her class in order to tear down the barriers which have been raised against her participation in the free competition of the marketplace. Capitalism's need to exploit and the development of the modern mode of production totally relieves her of having to fight such a struggle. On the contrary, new barriers need to be erected against the exploitation of the proletarian woman. Her rights as wife and mother need to be restored and permanently secured. Her final aim is not the free competition with the man, but the achievement of the political rule of the proletariat. The proletarian woman fights hand in hand with the man of her class against capitalist society. To be sure, she also agrees with the demands of the bourgeois women's movement, but she regards the fulfillment of these demands simply as a means to enable that movement to enter the battle equipped with the same weapons alongside the proletariat." So now, having discussed a primary figure in the socialist feminist movement in Zetkin, I want to move on to Lily Braun, who was a much less powerful figure in the party, but one who presents what I think is a really interesting alternative to the mainstream of socialist feminist thought that can be seen in Zetkin. So Lily Braun was born to a minor aristocratic family in 1865 in Halberstadt, Prussia. She had a close relationship with her grandmother and father, but by many accounts, the relationship with her mother was very strained, and this was influential on her ideological outlook going forward. And this is also a picture of her, I think around the age of 11 in 1876. In her biography of Braun, Ute Lischke argues that Braun's view of her mother as a victim of society, who imparted on her that it was a woman's duty to serve, suffer, and be silent, was to become a catalyst for her radical feminist and socialist ideas. It would be for me too, I think. In his biography of Braun, Alfred Meyer dedicates time to tracing the early radicalization of Braun through her later autobiographical work and her letters to a close cousin who seems to serve as her confidant during these times. And it's clear from these accounts that she experienced a lot of self-contempt as a young woman, which led to contempt for her entire aristocratic class. At the age of 11, when she first observed extreme poverty in the slums of Posen during a flood, quote, she reacted to the sight and smell of poverty with disgust. Poverty offended her aesthetic sense, but 5 years later, this had turned into shame over being privileged, end quote. And by 24, in letters to her cousin, she was criticizing capitalism openly. Having been interested in the work of German writer Johann Wolfgang von Goethe from an early age, she began to write for the yearbook of the Goethe Society in 1891. And from 1891 to 1893, she conducted research in the Goethe archive, learning about politics and literature, and becoming increasingly pulled towards political life in Berlin. So in 1894, after moving to Berlin, Braun joined the Verein Frauenwohl Society, which is the Association for the Well-Being of Women when translated to English, in 1895 being elected as an executive board member. And during this time, she also began writing for various feminist journals, becoming an important orator for the radical bourgeois feminist movement. The term bourgeois is very important here, as we will discuss later. During the 1890s in Berlin, she also begins to come under the influence of Fabian socialism, which was an ideology that valued educational reforms, changing society over a gradual transition period. And to summarize her views during this period of ideological development in Berlin, she believed strongly that women should have the right to develop themselves independently, and also believed that women were essentially obligated to do so. And this was a view that she would maintain throughout her career, even when she enters the Social Democratic Party. Suffrage, or women's suffrage, is also a key goal for Braun. During this time, her approach differed from Zetkin in the sense that she valued women's suffrage for the cultivation of self and the cultivation of women's rights, whereas Zetkin, as we discussed, viewed this more as a tool for greater proletarian strength rather than the individual development of the woman. Braun joined the SPD in 1896, and her ideology can be described as between democratic socialism and radical feminism, which earned her the disdain of many of her colleagues, namely Zetkin. And she was never, ever fully accepted into the Social Democratic Party because of her aristocratic background and her general refusal to meet the party line on many issues. So while I was researching, this biography sort of prompted me to ask the question, well, why did Braun join the SPD if she seems to disagree so strongly with many of their arguments? And I think that this is mostly because she wanted to better the conditions for the proletariat, whether for reasons of self-contempt for her own class or for reasons of genuine want of betterment is unclear, but I'd say it's probably a little bit of both. And she was convinced that she could make more change within a political party as opposed to operating on an individual basis. So now we'll get into issues that divided Zetkin and Braun. So first we'll talk about the ideology of socialist feminism versus radical feminism. Second, bourgeois collaboration. Third, women's sexuality and self-expression. Fourth, religion. And then we'll move into more broad issues again, revisionism, and then World War I. So first we'll talk about Lily Braun's thoughts on socialist feminism versus radical feminism. Historians tend to agree that Braun was a radical feminist who placed the fight for women's rights over the fight for class struggle and the proletariat as a whole. And author Uta Liszka writes that, quote, she increasingly alienated Clara Zetkin, as well as other women in the movement, by continuing to expound her own ideas with regard to the direction of the women's movement within the party. Braun found it difficult, given her concept to the right to self-cultivation and of retaining her individuality, to sacrifice her own views and the right to constructive criticism for the sake of the party, end quote. Clara Zetkin occupies an opposite viewpoint. She prioritized the socialist movement over the individual aims of women. In her essay, Socialism and Singleness, Clara Zetkin, Catherine Dollard argues that Zetkin's, quote, Marxist perspective required the subordination of feminist pursuits, such as expanded education and marriage rights, to class and party goals. Women's issues as such would not and could not be addressed in the socialist discourse, end quote. And having a background as an orator for the bourgeois feminist movement, Braun advocated for issues that were largely championed by bourgeois feminists, like maternity benefits, equal pay, and better working conditions for women. And these ideas and others Zetkin viewed as dangerous to social democracy and the unity of the SPD as a whole in the fight of class struggle. So next I'll move on to cooperation with bourgeois feminists. Braun was very invested in the idea of the bourgeois and proletarian women working together to achieve women's emancipation. And she believed that bourgeois women should have a place in the Socialist Party discourse. And Zetkin, although Zetkin is perceived in most of historiography to have come from a much more working class background than Braun, she tried to distance herself from many of the position of the bourgeois women's movement, but many authors argue that that bourgeois and liberal influence from her mother was lasting, despite her efforts to shake this off. And as I mentioned before, when discussing Zetkin's 1896 speech at the Gotha Congress, she believed that the bourgeois women's movement was based on gender and the socialist based on class. She also argued that bourgeois women wage war against the men of their class, whereas the socialist women work with the men to achieve equality through the defeat of capitalism. So essentially, in Zetkin's view, these two ideologies are fundamentally incompatible. And this anti-cooperation attitude is very consistent with the mindset that emerged during the anti-socialist law years, where the party was basically completely isolated and ostracized from political life. So this ideology of separateness developed through this time, and it's very present here. Although Zetkin faced opposition from within the party, as well as outside of it, regarding her stance on bourgeois feminism, she continued to argue that bourgeois feminism was nothing more than a reform movement, while the proletarian women's movement was revolutionary and as such must remain revolutionary. Essentially, for Zetkin, women's rights would not be won in the battle for feminism, but with the battle against capitalism. And this is an image of Lily Braun in the Association for Women's Suffrage in 1896, which I believe was a middle-class bourgeois women's organization for this purpose, and she is in the middle of the crowd here. Next, I want to talk about their opposing views on women's sexuality and self-expression. So as a young woman, Braun rebelled against the preordained roles for women in German society, quickly discovering that women were required to act in a certain way and suppress their sexual urges. She rejected marriage as she saw it as an economic transaction and the end of youth, and Braun believed that the liberation of women's sexuality from religious and moral restrictions would prove to be more fulfilling than economic or political emancipation. She advocated for more open sexual relationships between men and women, and she suggested that women too should be able to indulge in sex outside of marriage to abolish what she deemed the double standard of sexual morality. Zetkin, as we can imagine, holds a very opposite view. She believed in the idea of a moral marriage based in affection, monogamy, self-discipline, and avoidance of sexual indulgence, and of course, most importantly, shared socialist views. In Tiana Unledag's essay, Bourgeois Mentality and Socialist Ideology, as exemplified by Clara Zetkin's Constructs of Femininity, she argues that Zetkin strongly critiqued the concept of bourgeois marriage, writing that in its place, she set the moral marriage defined by references to Marx, Engels, and Bebel, but also with her own notable accents. Engels had given the monogamous relationship the greatest chance of succeeding in a socialist society, but otherwise left it for people to decide for themselves together, their own experience and their consequent opinion thereof. He thus created the possibility for a degree of freedom that it extended the horizons of what Zetkin was willing to allow. Zetkin believed that the goal of socialist feminists should not center on free sexual morality, but on socialist values concerning solidarity and class consciousness. So it's essential here to understand that Zetkin views these issues that Braun cares deeply about as sort of contradictory to the feminist movement, because her aim is to unite the feminist movement as one with the proletarian men as well. And these issues, such as women's sexuality and self-expression, she views as sort of a distraction from the primary goal. And compared to alternate ideals of sexual relationships and sexuality put forward by her peers, such as Braun, Zetkin's ideas were exceedingly conservative. And historians argue that Zetkin's lack of support for sexual self-determination and individuality was due in part to the fact that her collectivism excluded the autonomous development of lifestyles for women. Next, I want to talk about religion as it presents itself in Braun and Zetkin's ideology. Braun developed anti-religious sentiments very early on as a young woman. She distrusted Christian ideals insofar as they sexually repressed women, and she viewed Christian morality as a new form of oppression on top of the oppression of private property. Zetkin's views on religion are more difficult to discern. She never took as decisive a position as Braun, but we can see how conservative Christian values sort of present themselves in Zetkin's ideology indirectly. Her views on motherhood were very similar to conservative Christian views. Unledag argues that, quote, her concepts regarding the proletarian family, on the socially expanded motherliness of the working class woman, and on the ability and willingness of proletarian women to shoulder hardship and sacrifice, parallel positions of the moderate, conservative, and Christian factions within the bourgeois women's movement. The well-known bourgeois holy trinity of husband, wife, and child constituted the heart of even the socialist societal order, end quote. However, despite Zetkin's seeming alignment with more conservative values associated with Christianity, she did, in 1904, begin to direct her attention more intently on education and eliminating all religious influence from public education. So now I want to move into more broad issues again. So these issues will be disagreements between Zetkin and Braun, but also issues that permeated the social democratic movement at large. Edward Bernstein, the so-called father of revisionism, posed a challenge to the Marxist position that capitalism was inevitably going to fail as a system, pointing out that capitalism was already overcoming many of its weaknesses. These included unemployment, overproduction, and the inequitable distribution of wealth. He argued further that social conditions were improving, and with that, universal suffrage of the working class could establish socialism by electing socialist representatives as opposed to establishing the absolute rule of the proletariat. Lily Braun was very influenced by Bernstein. She embraced his reformist viewpoints, and she believed that positive change could be brought about under capitalism. Immediate reforms under the current system would provide the preconditions for the emergence of a socialist society. And we also see the influence of Fabian socialism again on her here. Again, the ideology that posits that gradual reforms under the current system can produce change. Clara Zetkin vehemently opposed revisionism because she viewed it as directly contradictory to the conception of capitalism put forth by Marx. Bernstein argued that capitalism had developed into a system capable of change and adjustment, meaning that economic crises were now able to be avoided. And there was now a possibility for larger capitalist expansion and more equitable distribution of wealth. And this split about revisionism in the party really reveals the fractious nature of the party. They did not split completely until the issue of World War I came up, but we can see just in this issue alone the sharp divide that occurs within the party. So lastly, I'm going to discuss World War I and Zetkin and Braun's, again, opposing views on World War I. They really can't agree on anything. Lily Braun, despite the progress of her position, the progressiveness of her position prior to the war, developed a very maternalist and nationalist agenda at the outset of the war. The maternalist and nationalist rhetoric stood Braun apart from the orthodox Marxist, like Zetkin. Her writings in 1916 saw basically complete betrayal of her previous radical feminist views, such as self-growth over procreation. She now valued the maternalist role of mothers much more. And she was a pacifist until the outbreak of the war, but she believed that World War I would create the socialist revolution and a new order. Clara Zetkin was extremely anti-militarism and anti-imperialism, so she strongly opposed the war, being one of the first members of the SPD to speak out against the party when they voted in favor of war credits in August of 1914. Zetkin saw the war as the outgrowth of capitalist competition, and she was vehemently against the Nazi Party. This disagreement between Zetkin and Braun regarding World War I separated the movement to such an extent that after the SPD voted in favor of war credits in 1914, the party had an internal split, the centrists in the majority forming the Independent Social Democracy Party and the left forming the Spartacus League, which would later be known as the Communist Party. So lastly, I'd like to share some concluding thoughts. Firstly, has my research question been answered? I believe I began this research project with the tentative hypothesis that the issues dividing Zetkin and Braun would permeate the wider movement, and hopefully through this presentation I have proved that. Secondly, why is this research significant? Why is it important to look at the socialist feminist movement when thinking about the state of feminism today? This study is significant because the lasting relevancy of its themes surrounding feminist discourse and collaboration are still relevant. My research focuses largely on issues of womanhood and women's participation in politics, each being a topic of discussion that continues to permeate today's feminist circles and wider political discourse. The woman question, which seems like an outdated topic, still seemingly has not gone away. People are still asking, how should women participate in politics? What is the role of the mother? Or what is the role of the woman? Is her central role as a mother the most important thing? And my research explores each of these questions in the context of the 19th century German socialist movement. yet they are largely applicable in the context of today's contemporary political and academic settings. I'd like to thank you all so much for listening to me talk for 45 minutes today. If you have any questions, I will of course answer some now, but feel free to contact me through email at hrmosier@willamette.edu. I have done very extensive readings on this topic. If anyone would like to ask me for reading recommendations, I have a ton. But yeah, thank you all so much for your time today.
Hi, I'm Bob. I've been thinking about a lot of things you said, and I want to say I was struck by the different class positions of the two thinkers, and wondering, and I'm not going to ask you this question, I'm going to ask you a more specific one, wondering whether their original class position had something to do with the way they ultimately developed their ideas on feminism. But the question I have, the specific question, from a socialist point of view, how would Braun explain the onset or the coming of full socialism as liberating women in the ways that I'm sorry, I misspoke. How would Zetkin explain how the coming of socialism would liberate women from the 3Ks and give them full equality? Because I didn't hear that in your talk, but to answer the question, she needs to be able to demonstrate that socialism will be the liberation of women in the full sense. And I was wondering how you would answer that.
Yeah, Zetkin essentially believed that women would achieve emancipation through the defeat of capitalism because of private property. So in the capitalist system, especially in middle-class families, the man of the house hands down the property to the son instead of the woman, and this was sort of the essential origin of Zetkin's argument and also Friedrich Engels' argument that private property is the root of women's oppression. So I think if she were asked, she would probably say that the abolition of private property sort of paves the way for greater women's freedoms in the socialist world. I hope that answers your question.
But proletarians don't have private property.
The abolition of private property would allow for greater freedoms for women because there isn't that sort of barrier of private property separating women from economic freedoms.
So what are the implications of this for our situation today, where we're seeing a lot of the very fundamental philosophical issues they were addressing reemerging as contests, if you would, for the social conscience?
Yeah, the thing that really jumped out to me throughout my research was sort of the extreme exclusion that Lily Braun, coming from an aristocratic background, experienced inside the party. And I think that type of prejudice is also very common today in political circles. Hopefully that gets to your question, but yeah, I think that the exclusion that Braun experienced is I believe that one of the problems of politics today is that people are unwilling to consider other people's viewpoints, and this definitely happened in the SPD during this time, and it's one of the reasons that Braun never sort of was able to rise to a higher status in the SPD.
Hi, this is Brenda. I come from an older time, and I'm curious because when a lot of us were growing up in the 70s, it was the women's movement, and it was very important to try and move forward. Do you feel that women your age are worried about the future of feminist ideals, women's movement, and those types of things? And do you see through this study a way to hopefully prepare yourself to those movements?
My goodness, that is a thinker. I think that, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, the question just left my brain.
Do you just feel better prepared through this study to help you navigate what might be coming with our current divide in what people feel women's role should be in this country?
Yeah, okay. I think during this time, it's a very scary time for minorities everywhere. It's a very scary time for women. And I think that during this time, it's very important to have conversations about what the future will be like and to come together in community during this difficult time, which is something that in the SPD, they had a lot of community around proletarian women's issues, which is why the movement was able to become so strong. And I think that hopefully can serve as an inspiration for women today.
Over here, this is Janet, and I'm not sure if you said when there was suffrage granted to women in Germany, and was there any influence of Jewish women in Germany at the time?
Yeah.
In this movement?
Sorry. I believe that, and Professor Smaldone can correct me if I'm wrong, I believe women gained the vote in 1918. Yes. Yes. I get an A in the class. But I'm so sorry. What was the second?
And then any Jewish women of influence on either the feminist or the socialist movement?
Yeah, so Rosa Luxemburg was a huge influence in the socialist movement. She and Zetkin were very good friends throughout the entirety of their career. And she was, throughout her career, I believe, a lot more focused on working class issues as opposed to specifically women's issues. But she was, I mentioned the split of the Social Democratic Party, half of it forming into the Communist Party of Germany. And Luxemburg, before her death, was one of the leading members of the new Communist Party that split out of the Social Democratic Party alongside Zetkin.
Hi, this is Joan. This sort of follows up on what Brenda and Janet were talking about splits in the women's movement. Brenda's very young. My women's movement was in the 60s, started in the 60s. And it wasn't until years later that it sort of became generally known that the extent to which that Betty Friedan and people like that were consciously not joining with, say, black men in the civil rights movement or black women, because they felt it more important to focus on what maybe you would call the bourgeois women's issues. I don't know, but do you think it's possible for people who feel, people are living their own lives and have their own concerns, and we can get outside of them. I firmly believe we can get outside of our own concerns and our own milieu and understand other people's problems. But there are people, especially nowadays, who don't think you can understand something unless you've actually been through it. And that's a divisive attitude. It's not that I don't understand the attitude, but I think it makes it more difficult for people to get together for issues that they do have in common. So do you think that all of the oppressed groups, the minority groups, will ever really get together for an uprising that works?
I hope so.
So do I.
Yeah, my name is Don. I read a book quite a while ago called American Socialism by Irving Howe, and in it he sort of faults the socialist movement in America for not properly addressing the issue of racism. And it's the socialist, racism was subsumed under the ideology of socialism, where, you know, capitalism is the origin of all sins. Do you feel like Zetkin, by subsuming women's concerns, and they would have, you know, very real concerns that are unique to women, by subsuming that under socialist ideology, do you personally feel that she might have shortchanged women's interests and women's concerns?
Yeah, that is a really good question. I don't think I can find the perfect way to answer that, but socialism, at least in Europe, was an ideology that attracted all sorts of minorities. It was the party that was promoting solidarity without exclusion. For one, they were very inclusive of Jewish people in the party. I don't know much about Zetkin's rhetoric about Jewish people or other minorities in particular, but in my research, and this research is still ongoing, so maybe I will look into this, but I don't think that the socialist feminists really focused too much on race in their discourse. Hopefully that can answer a little bit of your question.
Sharon, last night had an interesting thing on TV on C-SPAN, and the Muslim religion is galloping ahead in the world today. It's outgoing any other religion by leaps and bounds. Did that issue with socialism on the women's movement enter? I know this, again, is more of a current, well, maybe it isn't, though.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I didn't come across anything about sort of the interaction of Muslims with socialism, but as I mentioned in the presentation, there was sort of a general anti-religious rhetoric happening in the socialist movement, but that was specifically in reference to Christianity. For example, I talked about Zetkin's crusade against Christianity being featured in the education given in public schools, and obviously Braun's very enthusiastic thoughts about Christianity, but I'm not too sure if they really focused on other religions.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Anna.
you.
This is very interesting. We'll count on you sometime to solve all of our problems. We'll be in, nursing homes and things like that, but the word will percolate down. Thank you. We don't have time for more questions. I'm sorry. Hannah, on behalf of WICL, I'd like to present you with a certificate. Thank you so much. Can go on your wall of fame when you have one. And a check, which is probably more immediately useful. Thank you. Professor Smaldone, we have acknowledgement for you as well.